Hi Year 11, as you well know, we've got the mock exam happening on Thursday the 12th of November. Now it's going to be a 1 hour exam, and what I'm going to do today is just quickly talk you through how we approach these different exam questions and how we can get a grade 8 or 9 and the basic techniques for it. Now we will also go over this briefly in lesson, but this is just for those of you that have requested that you want to know a little bit more about how we approach these different types of questions and what exactly the mock is going to look like. So hopefully you recognise this sheet that we've got down the left-hand side. This is something that we've stuck into all of our exam books, making sure that you know what your exam will be like and what the questions will be asking you. Now, on the right-hand side, we've just got a summary of what the different questions will be like. This exam will last an hour in the mock on Thursday the 12th of November, but also your real exam, which will take place in June, will be exactly the same in terms of the format and how the questions will start. So we've done lots of practicing of this before. Hopefully you're going to be feeling confident when you go into this mock exam. So the 4 types of questions you're going to get asked. The first one is going to be a how useful question. They'll give you a source. It could be written, it could be a picture source, and you'll have to talk about how useful that source is for studying that certain topic. That's going to be worth 8 marks, so you spend about 10 to 12 minutes on it. The second type of question you're going to be asked is a significance question. Again, it's going to be worth 8 marks, so you spend about 10 to 12 minutes on it. The third question you're going to be asked is you're going to be asked to compare either 2 different time periods, 2 different wars, or you could be asked to compare 2 different individuals. And again, as it's worth 8 marks, we're going to spend about 10 to 12 minutes on it. And the final question that you're going to be asked is a factor-based question, where it's going to ask you about one of the 7 factors. Now, there are 3 that we need to really make sure we know for this mock exam, because we know this is going to be on public health, and therefore we need to make sure we know individuals, communication, and government as our 3 factors. Now, because that's worth 16 marks, you're going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes on that answer. Some students prefer to start with the big question and then work their way back throughout the smaller questions. It's totally up to you, but you need to make sure during the exam that you're keeping an eye on the clock so you can get all 4 questions done in the hour. So let's look at the first type of question in a little bit more detail. So no matter what, in your mock and your real exam, the question will always start the same. It will say, how useful is source A for understanding, and then it will name the topic. It will then ask you to use the source and your own knowledge to explain. Now, this could be on anything. It could be on any individual, it could be on a particular war, it could even be on a particular type of medicine, for instance, penicillin. It could be on any of those types of things. Remember, for your mock, you're actually only having to revise a small amount of topics, and therefore the source would have to be on one of those topics that is listed on that Show My Homework page. Now, no matter what the question's about, there is a technique which, if you follow it, will mean that you can do really, really well. There's going to be 3 paragraphs if we're going to do a really good answer. And remember, you've only got about 10 to 12 minutes to be writing about the source. Now, in the first paragraph, we suggest you start with the content of the source. Now, this should involve content, but also some own knowledge. We don't want to just simply regurgitate what is in the source and say what we see. We've got to be more sophisticated than that. We've got to blend in our own knowledge. And we'll talk through an example in a second. So first of all, we need to make sure we're using the source. What can we learn from it? For instance, if it's a picture source, what can we pick out from it? If it is a written source, what quotes can we extract from it? Now, we need to make sure this is really linked to the question. So we want to see phrases like, the source is useful because it shows, and we want to make sure that that's in there. Now, we don't just want to say what it says, because that's not very sophisticated. We want to then blend that with some own knowledge. So we want to see phrases like, I know that, or I know this from my own knowledge because. So we want to see you making, ideally, at least 2 points from the source blended with own knowledge. Now, once we've done that, our second paragraph that we're going to need to do is one on provenance. Now, this is the thing that students normally forget, but it's absolutely crucial if we want to get above 5 out of 8. So we have to think about the who, the why, and the where. We have to think about, can we trust this source? So we need to consider things like the author, the audience, and the purpose. And we need to think about, how does this affect what the source is showing us? So we might need to use some of our own knowledge in that answer as well. And we'll talk through an example of that in a second. So we need to make sure that we are evaluating that provenance and thinking about, does that affect how useful it is? Now, when we get to paragraph 3, we're then just doing our conclusion, where we're coming to an overall judgment. It's asked us how useful is the source for understanding the topic. We need to actually make a judgment on that. Is it very useful? Is it useful to an extent? And we want to consider both the content and also the reliability. So we need to blend our answer thinking about content and provenance. Now that's the general technique that you can apply to any of these source questions, but we'll look and talk through an example to make sure you understand it. So we've just talked about the technique and we know what the 3 paragraphs are going to have to be on. We're going to look now at an example. Now, unfortunately, this is not going to be in the mock, but it is a topic that you are revising for the mock because it's part of public health and also part of medieval medicine generally. So this is an example question. Study source D. How useful is source D to a historian studying the Black Death in 1348? And we can see here a picture, and then we've got the information about the provenance next to it, where it's said that this source is from 1368 and it shows monks with the plague being blessed by a priest. It's from a manuscript made by monks. Now, in the exam, you don't have too long to be able to write about this. You only have between 10 and 12 minutes, but it's certainly worth having a quick minute or so looking at the source and maybe even annotating it for some key points that you're going to want to talk about. Now, I'll talk through some model points for this in a second in lots of depth, but some things that I would immediately be picking out, the things that I would be annotating straight away, is I would be thinking about, for instance, what it tells us about the symptoms of the Black Death. We can clearly see that these monks have been affected by the bubonic plague. We could even talk about things like the importance of religion, the fact that we can see here that a priest is blessing these monks. Now, we don't want to just talk about what we see, because that's not going to show very high level thinking. We need to blend it with some own knowledge. So we might be talking about the importance of religion. We might talk about the fact that actually priests did bless people, because remember, they felt that the Black Death was caused by God being very upset with people for their sins. So we could bring that own knowledge out into this answer. We'd also want to potentially annotate this and think about the provenance as well. So we might think about the fact that this is 20 years after the Black Death is hit Britain. We might talk about that in our answer, talk about what is the point of this manuscript that has been made by these monks. So the very first thing I would always do is just have a quick annotate before I began my answer. Now we're going to talk through some examples of some points that you could have put for this in more detail on the next slide. If you want to, it might even be a good idea to pause this video now and have a go at seeing what your points would be, so then you can compare it to the model points that are on the next slide. That would be a really good revision activity if you wanted to give that a go. So we've talked about some of the points that you could make when we just discussed the kind of things that we might annotate around the source using our first minute of the exam. Here are some points that you could have picked out. It will be interesting to see if these are points that you've already put down. I imagine lots of you would have already come up with most of these. So remember, when we're talking about how the source is useful, we're going to do our first paragraph, which is going to be on content. Our second paragraph is going to be on the provenance, and our third paragraph is going to be on the conclusion. That's why I've got these 3 separate boxes here. So thinking about points you could have had about the content and blending some own knowledge. We could have talked about how the source is useful because it shows that it wasn't just the poor or people that lived in the crowded cities that were affected by the Black Death. You could blend some own knowledge into this, and you could talk about the fact that these monks would have lived in the monasteries, and actually the monasteries were really badly affected by the Black Death as well, even though they were traditionally much cleaner than other places, because they were often going and giving things like the last rites, and they were looking after people that had been very ill. A lot of people died, and it wasn't just in one area. You could talk about the nationwide impact, the fact that 1/3 of the population died of the Black Death. You could have also talked, and I think this is probably the easiest of the points, about the symptoms of the plague that we can very clearly see in that picture. We could see all the dark blotches on their skin, we could see the buboes. You could have talked about some own knowledge about how the Black Death involved both the bubonic plague and actually the more deadly version of the pneumonic plague that was going around as well. So we could have talked about the symptoms and how it affected the body, and also the fear that came with that as well. And then I think probably the most crucial of the points we could have picked out about the fact they believed that religion would help cure them. So in that picture, we can very clearly see that these monks are being blessed by a priest. And that is because they believe that God has caused the illness because he's upset with the people for their sins. And therefore, they see religion as the cure as well. So we know that a lot of people called the flagellants would whip themselves to say they were sorry. We know that there was a lot of blessing that was going on, people that were confessing to their sins. Lots of this was seen as a treatment and a prevention for the Black Death. So they're just some examples of points that we could use. Remember that we would say something like, this source is useful. We'd pick out one of those points about what we could see, and then we'd try and blend that with own knowledge. And once we've done our paragraph on that, and that's probably going to be our biggest paragraph, we would then need to move on to the second paragraph, talking about the provenance of the source. Now, it's really important you discuss not only what a source shows you, but also why it's being produced, when it's being produced, and thinking about how does that affect what it says. Provenance is really, really important, equally important as what the content is saying. So let's have a little look at some points that we could have used. Now, first of all, we could have talked about the when. This has been produced in the year 1368, which is very soon after the Black Death hits England in 1348. It is after the main epidemic, but this is something that would have been experienced by the creator. It's highly unlikely that they wouldn't have had any knowledge about what the Black Death is like at this point, because it would be something that is in the national consciousness and it has been experienced by the creator. So we can talk about the fact that it is actually accurate, and we know about this from multiple different sources, but also it is within the lifetime of the Black Death. It's also happening and it's been created in the 14th century. We can also talk about the fact that it's from a manuscript made by monks to show the importance of religion in helping with disease. This is all about the purpose of the source. Now, the purpose, the why, is really, really crucial, and it's so important that you remember to look at that. So here, it is clearly being created as a religious source to show people the importance of religion. They are trying to show that if you want to get rid of the plague, if you want to live, you need to turn to religion. And that goes with what they wanted people to believe. You know, the church liked the control over the people at this point. They wanted people to see that actually this disease was caused by God, because it's something that they genuinely believed. But they also genuinely believe that people need to atone for their sins if they're going to stop this outbreak of the plague and any further ones. So it's kind of serving as a reminder of the importance of religion and what can happen if you turn your back on God. Thinking about, is it very reliable? Do we trust it? Well, people did turn to religious men to help them. So this is something that is accurate, that fits with our own knowledge, and we need to put that in our answer. So overall, I would argue that this source is quite useful because it's asking us how useful is it for studying the Black Death. Well, it's quite useful for showing the importance of religion and how they believed things might be cured. However, it doesn't tell us much about the Black Death overall. And you could discuss in your conclusion, if you wanted, about what it's kind of missing, any key points about that. You could talk about something like the mass death, the fact that a third of the population died. You could talk about other causes that people believed in, like miasma and the planets and things like that, if you wanted to. But remember, we've got to do this in about 10 to 12 minutes, and our really key paragraphs are going to be our first two. If you're still unsure about how to answer those questions, just feel free to message us on Show My Homework, or we can always, if we need to, talk through some more examples with you in lesson. Okay, so your second type of question will be a significance question. It will always start with explain the significance of, and that will be all the question is asking you to do. Now, this could be on any particular topic. It could be on an individual, so it could say something like explain the significance of John Ardern to the development of medicine, explain the significance of Hippocrates, or explain the significance of Galen to the development of medicine. It could even be on a factor. For instance, it could say something like explain the significance of war to the development of medicine in the 1900s, or explain the significance of religion in the medieval period. There's lots of different questions that it could be on, but essentially we need lots of knowledge in this answer. So this question is really testing how much do you know. So let's have a little look at how we're going to do really well on this question. Now, first of all, we need to make sure that we have 2 paragraphs in this answer. If you can do a third, fantastic, but you only need to do 2 to get 8 out of 8. Now, we need to make sure that we've clearly said in the first sentence for each paragraph why that person or that event or that type of medicine was significant. So the examiner is looking for us straight away to put our first point there about why it's significant and then support with lots of detailed knowledge. So we need to make sure that we're using phrases like this was significant because it led to. We need to make sure we're really focused on the question. Then we do the same for our second paragraph, where again we'd pick out another reason why that person or that event was significant, and then we'd support with lots of own knowledge if we can. Now, if this is on an individual, we would always do this by looking at the short and long-term impacts. Remember, we've practiced that lots and lots in lesson, especially in year 10. We should hopefully know that we always look at their short-term impact and their long-term impact. If it's not on an individual, if it's asking you about a factor, for instance, war or religion, then we just need to pick out 2 points and make sure that we're supporting those with loads of knowledge. Now, to make sure that we are going to get those top marks, we have to show that we are focused on the question. So we want to see the word significant throughout your answer. So that's the kind of key thing about how we're going to answer this question. We're going to talk about 2 points about why something's significant. We're going to write as much as we can in those 10 to 12 minutes. And we're going to, if we can, try and consider things like long and short-term impacts. So that's the key there of how we're going to do well. What we'll do now is look at an example question. So just like last time, we're going to look at an example so that you understand it fully and you see how to apply your knowledge. So here's an example that could come up in the mock. Explain the significance of John Snow's discovery of the cause of cholera in improving public health. So it's just asking us to look at the significance of John Snow and what are the implications of his work. Now, what I'd like you to do now, if you're already watching this, is to just pause this video and just on a scrap piece of paper, write down some points, see what you can come up with. Think about how you'd break that down into 2 paragraphs, what would you put it on and what kind of points can you come up with. So pause it now and have a go at that for me, please. So I'm just going to talk you through the kinds of things that I would put in my answer on this. Now, first of all, well done if you divided it into short term and long term. If we're doing an answer on an individual, it's definitely the best way of approaching this. So in my short term paragraph, I would end up describing the situation before. If we're going to think about the significance of something, we want to think about what the situation was like before that person. So for me, I'd be talking about the impact of cholera. I'd talk about how it came to Britain in 1831 and the fact that over 50,000 people died during that initial outbreak. I would then, once I'd done that, describe what he did. So I'd be talking about that experiment, that hypothesis, where he realised that actually the Broad Street pump was the thing that was in common with all of those people's deaths. So I'd briefly mention about how he does things like removing that pump handle and how he works out that there is a link between dirty water and disease. Now, because it's our short-term paragraph, at the end, I want to make sure I'm linking back to that question again and saying this is significant because actually this is the first person who is establishing the link between dirty water and disease. This is really crucial for improving things when it comes to cholera, but also generally for the health of the nation. That was a really crucial discovery. Actually, they had to do something better to get rid of human waste, and they had to make sure they had access to clean running water. Now, there's a lot to say in that paragraph, and so this one would inevitably end up being bigger than our second one, which will be on the long term. And when we're thinking about short term, we're kind of thinking about the immediate impact of that discovery. When we think about long term, we have to think about the implications of that discovery afterwards and what happened as a result. So we want to think about how did his discovery in 1854 impact health and public health in particular afterwards. So I would talk about the implications of his work being improvement of the sewer systems. Now, this was partially down to the Great Stink, and you could mention that in your answer, but we'd want to talk about how Bazalgette was employed to improve the sewer systems in London, how he created those blueprints for European cities, and all of this came down to the fact that they realised they had to do something like this if they were going to prevent any further outbreaks of cholera. So it is partially down to Jon Snow's work, and it's definitely worth highlighting that, and the fact that as a result of that, cholera never returns to London. So because of those two key individuals working together, and because Bazalgette listened to the work of Jon Snow. The other really crucial thing to understand with this question is that Jon Snow's discovery contributed to the 1875 Second Public Health Act. Now remember, the first one was published in 1848, but actually it wasn't very good because it wasn't compulsory. This one is compulsory, and it is passed due to a number of reasons, like working class men getting the vote, the Great Stink, but also the work of Jon Snow contributed as well. So in our answer, we need to make sure that we've got two clear paragraphs. We need to come up with at least two reasons why he's significant, and we need to make sure we're linking back to the question throughout. But generally, this question is all about knowledge, and you get as much down that is relevant as possible. Okay, so that's an example of a significance question. Please feel free to email your teachers if you want any more examples or if you're still stuck with that particular question. Let's move on to the next one. So our third type of question is going to be an 8-mark question asking you to look at the similarities between two events or two people. Now in the real exam and the mock, it will always start in the same way, where it will say explain two ways in which blank and blank are similar. Now all we have to do well in this answer is to write two detailed paragraphs, just like with the significance question. The first paragraph is going to need to introduce why something is similar, what is the similarity between them, and then support with loads of detailed own knowledge. And the second paragraph is going to be exactly the same, saying a different similarity between those two events or those two people, and then again supporting it with lots of detailed evidence. Now the really crucial thing is to make sure that you are considering both time periods equally. Even if they asked you to compare two things and you only knew one of them really well, you would need to make sure that you are discussing both events or both people equally, because they are expecting to see knowledge of both time periods or both events in this question. So it's a really simple technique. Spend those 10 to 12 minutes talking about two similarities in as much depth as you can do in that time. Now we're going to look through an example so you see how it works in reality in a second. So we're going to look now at an example of a comparison question. Obviously this won't be coming up in the mock in this way, but this is an example of what it could say. It could say, explain two ways in which the Black Death in the 14th century and the Great Plague in the 17th century were similar. Now, what I'd like you to do again is to have a go at this on your own. You can use your notes to help you, but try and come up with the similarities between those two events and any details. You could just do it roughly as some bullet points, but it would be a really good idea to revise those two key periods by looking at it and thinking about what are the similarities between them, and then you can compare it to my points on the next slide afterwards. So just pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so let's look through an example answer. This isn't all the points you could use. This is just an example of two paragraphs you could have written. Okay, so the first paragraph that I'm going to talk about is the lack of understanding about the cause of disease with both of them. Now we need to very clearly state for the examiner straight away that we are talking about the first similarity. So I would say something like, the first way in which they are similar is because in both plagues they had no understanding about what caused disease. So then once I've stated that similarity, I need to back it up with some more own knowledge, because remember I need to get 4 marks out of this paragraph. So I need to show off as much own knowledge as I can. You could talk about the fact that in neither of the plagues did they understand that the plague was brought through trade to England. We could even talk about things like what they believed caused the plague at the time. So they had lots of different ideas. There was no real consensus about what caused it. Everybody was arguing it was a different thing. Now, most people did believe that it was God that caused it. They believed that God was punishing them for their sins and therefore wanted them to repent. So we could talk about that as a reason. You could even show off own knowledge about the planets and how people believed it was caused because the planets were misaligned. You could talk about things like miasma and the fact they believed it was bad smells that caused disease. You could even talk about how they blamed other animals other than rats. Now, they also didn't understand that poor public health made these issues much worse. And again, you could bring in some of that own knowledge there and discuss the dirty and cramped conditions in both periods that made it so much worse because we got more spread of vermin and therefore the fleas as well. You could even, if you wanted to, discuss about the fact that both plagues suffered from pneumonic and bubonic plague and the fact that they didn't understand the differences between those and the fact that they were circulating at the same time. You wouldn't need to say all of that to get the first full marks, but there's some examples there of what you could use in your answer. Now, once we've done that first paragraph, we need to move on to our second similarity because we need to get the other 4 marks. And again, we need to very clearly state what is the similarity that this paragraph is going to be on. And I'm going to argue that their responses were similar. So I'd say something like, a second way in which the Black Death and Great Plague were similar was that their responses to this crisis was very similar. So I might talk about the fact that in both of them, they were very ineffective at dealing with the plague and the Black Death. I might talk about the fact that that's because they had no real idea about what caused it and therefore they couldn't respond to it effectively. I might discuss the fact that in both plagues, there was some quarantining. Now, we know from our own knowledge this is done to a much greater extent in the Great Plague, thanks to the Mayor of London and him putting those crosses on the door and quarantining people. However, there is still some quarantining that goes on in the Black Death. So you could talk about both of them doing some kind of quarantining. You could talk about the Great Plague and the 40 days with the cross on the door. And you could also talk about the fact that in the Black Death, they did try and shut off some towns because they wanted to try and make sure they weren't as badly affected as the cities. You could even talk about how they responded with lots of similar cures and way of preventing the plague. So you could talk about things like how they burned herbs to banish bad air, to tackle that miasma. You could talk about doing things like the fact that they bled people because they still believed in the 4 humours and that it might have been caused by an excess of blood. And you can even talk about the use of prayer and how they prayed a lot because they believed that God had caused this illness. So those 2 paragraphs there are just some examples about what you could do. And it's fine whatever similarities you pick out, but it's worth jotting some down when you first see the question because you want to make sure that the 2 similarities you pick are the ones you've got the most to say. You don't want to say something that's similar and then have nothing to really back it up. You want to make sure you've got lots and lots of points to support those 2 initial similarities that you're picking out. So that's one example of those types of questions. So the final type of question you're going to be asked in your exam is going to be a 16-mark factor question, and it will always look something like this in both the mock and the real thing. So it will say, has, and then they'll name a factor, been the main factor in understanding, and then they'll give you a topic, for instance, public health. Explain your answer with reference to that factor and other factors. Now, for the real exam, there are going to be 7 factors that you will need to know in depth. You'll need to know about war, superstition and religion, chance, government, communication, science and technology, and the role of the individual. So we need to know about all of those 7 factors. You'd have to talk about the one that they mention in the question. So in the real exam, they could mention any one of those 7, and you would then have to pick 2 others that you remembered and discuss them. We'd need to write about 3 factors, therefore, and do a conclusion, and we'd want to give lots of specific examples. Now, for your mock, we've made it much easier. The real exam will do loads of revision before, making sure you're really comfortable with those 7 factors. But for the mock, we've made it a little bit easier for you to be successful. We know that your mock question is going to be on public health, and there are only 3 factors that it can mention, because only 3 of them are really relevant. There's no examples really of religion helping develop public health over time. So we've had to pick, it's going to either be about government, communication, or the role of the individual. No matter which question we pick, it's going to be one of those 3, and therefore you're still going to have to write about all 3 of them, no matter which one we pick anyway. So to do well in this question, we need to make sure that we are considering the topic over time. We need lots of examples, and we want to make sure that every paragraph has examples from at least 3 different time periods. So for instance, if you're writing about government, you want to make sure that you've got an example of government from the medieval period, from the Renaissance period, from the 1800s, and from the 1900s, and exactly the same for other factors. So we're going to end up having 3 big factor paragraphs and then a conclusion. And we want to make sure that we're writing in as much detail as we can. It's also really important that we link back to the question throughout, especially at the end of that paragraph, and say something like, therefore, government has been a very important factor in understanding public health because. So we need to make sure that we really know this technique, and we're going to go through an example that we actually already discussed in lesson, but just in case you missed the lesson, maybe you were isolating or you're in drama, we'll just make sure we go through that key stuff. So here's an example that we talked through in lesson, and if you were here for lesson, you can skip through this unless you were a little bit unsure, and then it's worth re-watching. But for the people that are away, let's look at this question here, where it's a standard example of a 16-mark question, where it says, has the role of individuals been the main factor in the development of medicine in Britain since medieval times? Explain your answer with reference to individuals and other factors. Now, the first thing I would do in an exam is make sure that I was really clear exactly what they are asking. So the first thing I'd do is I'd underline as a factor. Okay, so this bit here is the factor, the bit where it said the role of the individuals. So I know that my first paragraph is going to have to be all about individuals over time. Now, it's not just asking me to talk about the individuals, but it's asking me to think and focus on how individuals have helped develop medicine since medieval times. It'll always say something like that because they don't want to narrow the question. They want you to show knowledge of this 1,000 years of history that we have been studying. So you would have to write about individuals no matter what for your first paragraph, and then after that you could pick whatever 2 other factors you wanted for that question. So I'm not going to read this all out because you can stop it and have a little look at it in front of you. Lots of you probably already have this printed or have seen it before. But this is an example of a really good top grade 8 or 9 paragraph on individuals. So remember, your first paragraph is going to have to be on the factor in the question. Therefore, that's why we've got this one on individuals here. And this is an example of how we do really well. So what is good about this answer is there is a clear focus of that paragraph in that first sentence. It's really clear as an examiner that they know they've got to talk about individuals and they've introduced that. We've then got some examples of all 4 time periods. So we can see there is some examples from the medieval period. We've got examples next in the grey from the Renaissance period. We've got some examples from the 1800s in that blue colour. And then lastly, we have got some examples from the 1900s. Now, not only have they mentioned all 4 time periods, but what else is really good about this is the fact that they have really focused on the question. And they're not just stating relevant facts, but then linking back and explaining how this helps develop medicine. How does this help people understand the cause of disease? So it's a really good answer that has those 4 time periods. It also at the end has a link back to the question, which is really good, where it says that key individuals, with the help of improved technology and science and inspired by war in some cases, have made significant developments in medicine. So it's very clear from looking at this answer that this person has really focused on the question and said lots about individuals, but they've also highlighted that there are other factors that they're going to be writing about. So I can already tell as an examiner from reading this, the next paragraph they're going to write is either going to be on war or science and technology. So they've linked those factors together, even in the end of their first individual's paragraph. So I think this is a really strong answer. We need to remember that for your mock, you are going to be writing about public health. So you are going to have to write about individuals, communication and government over time. Now, it's really important, even though we've given you an example paragraph on individuals here, we don't just go away and try and learn what's in this paragraph, because this is for a general question on the development of medicine and not specifically on public health. So when you're revising for this, please get out those sheets that we colour coded into our 3 factors. Please use those to help you, and don't look at any factors of individuals that have got nothing to do with public health. So for instance, it's not a good idea to look at people like Paré or Louis Pasteur, because they're not really contributing to public health here. Make sure you're staying focused on those individuals and those factors that are relevant for the development of public health. If you feel really sure of this, you can skip this little bit of the video, but I just wanted to recap the key points of how we answer this question, because it's the most crucial as it's worth 16 marks. So we need to make sure we've got those 4 paragraphs, 3 factor paragraphs and a conclusion. We need to make sure that the first paragraph has to be on the factor named in the question. In the case that we just looked at, it was about individuals. Your mock question could ask you about individuals, communication or government, and you have to be ready to start with that factor that's named in the question. We also need to make sure that every factor paragraph has ideally an example from all 4 time periods. So when you're writing about government, you want to include a medieval, a Renaissance, an 1800s and a 1900s example. When you're talking about individuals, again, make sure you've mentioned all those 4 time periods. And when you're mentioning communication, also try and talk about 4 time periods if possible. So once you've done that and you've talked about those 3 factors, you're then going to do a conclusion. And it's exactly the same how you get a grade 9 in health as it is in the rest of the units. And that is that we want to link factors together if we can to get those grade 8 and 9. So for instance, if you're going to talk about the importance of individuals, you might talk about how those individuals led to the government then putting in place those changes. You might talk about how it's communication and the spread of diseases that led to the work of those key individuals. Whatever your argument's going to be, try and show a sophisticated argument by linking those factors together if you can. Okay, so moving on to the final thing. Now this is still about the 16 mark factor question, and if you recognise this activity, you can end the video here and you don't need to do this. But for anybody that hasn't already had a go, this is a really important activity that could help you do really well on the mock. Now we know that our factor question is going to involve us writing 4 paragraphs, 3 on factors and then a conclusion. We've just looked at an example where it named individuals and then we had to talk about 2 other factors. Now, in the case of our mock, it is going to be about public health, and we know that we're going to have 3 paragraphs on government, individuals, and also communication before then coming to a conclusion. Now, we can't mark this for you because that would help you too much before the mock, and we've already given you a lot of guidance, but it's worth you having a go and a bit of a practice of trying to answer this question. So we've got a factor question here where it says, has government been the main factor in the development of public health in Britain since the medieval times? So what I'd like you to do is spend about 10 minutes, no more, having a go at writing about government and how that's helped the development of public health over time. Now, if you're struggling with this, don't forget that you can use those knowledge booklets that we were given in lesson. Now, the best one to use is the one where it's a couple of sheets where we highlighted it into those 3 different factors. That's what I'd have in front of me as I was answering this. So try and make sure it's your best answer possible. Try and make sure that this paragraph includes examples from all 4 time periods and that you're linking back to the question and explaining how this helped the development of public health. So have a go at it. You can't email it to us for marking because we can't give you any feedback on it, but it is still a really worthwhile task, and best of luck with it. So that's the end of this PowerPoint today, going through the exam technique. If there are any questions, obviously you can come and see us in that first week after half term before the mock, and we can go through anything that you're unsure of. Okay, thank you very much for listening.